Today, we're going to talk about a number. But this isn't just about statistics. It's a story about fathers and brothers and sons who, in the middle of a brutal war, were just accused of being rebels. We're going to dive into the Mukura Massacre of 1989, drawing on this incredibly detailed report from the Justice and Reconciliation Project. And we're not just going to recount what happened. We're going to explore what their long, painful search for justice tells us about what it really takes for a community to heal.
69. Just let that number hang in the air for a second. It represents a tragedy that for decades now has been this deep, unhealed wound for a whole community in eastern Uganda.
So that's what this is all about. The story of those 69 men. These were civilians, farmers, husbands, sons, accused of being rebel collaborators. And their deaths, well, that sparked this long, painful, and honestly often frustrating search for acknowledgement, for accountability, and for some kind of real reconciliation.
So how could something like this even happen? To understand that, you really have to go back in time and look at the incredibly volatile state of Uganda back in the late 1980s. The whole country was basically just emerging from years of civil war, and the new government was desperately trying to get a grip on things. Okay, so the key players you need to know about are the National Resistance Army, or the NRA. Now, they were led by Yoweri Museveni, and they had just taken power in 1986 after a long, drawn-out guerrilla war. So they were now the government, and it was their job to try and pacify a country that was just deeply, deeply divided. And this slide really gets to the heart of those divisions. You see, the conflict was fueled by these deep ethnic and political fault lines. The NRA was made up of mostly people from western Uganda. But the army they had just defeated, the UNLA, was mostly made up of soldiers from the north and northeast. So when many of those defeated soldiers fled, they went home and formed rebel groups. And that meant their home regions, places like Teso, became these hotbeds of resistance against the new NRA government. And that brings us right here to the Teso region. This became the absolute epicenter of the conflict. It was the heartland of the Uganda People's Army, or UPA, a rebel group that was fiercely fighting Museveni's new government. So what did the NRA do? They launched these incredibly aggressive counterinsurgency operations, sending in battalions like the 106th, which the locals called the Pili-Pili, or Red Pepper Battalion, to just crush the rebellion. So here's the crucial problem, right? The NRA soldiers who were on the ground, they had an incredibly hard time telling who was a rebel fighter and who was just an ordinary civilian. This quote from the report just nails it. They were trying to solve a problem, the rebellion, but their methods were so crude, so flawed, that it was a disaster waiting to happen, and it led to the deaths of so many innocent people.
You know, the massacre itself wasn't some spontaneous one-off event. Not at all. It was the horrifying final act of a 4-day ordeal for hundreds of men. So let's just walk through the timeline of how this whole tragedy unfolded.
So, it all started around July 6th with some initial arrests, but the main operation really kicked into high gear on July 8th. That's when NRA soldiers just swept through villages, rounding up hundreds of men. For the next 2 days, these men were held. They were interrogated, they were tortured at the Okungulo Railway Station, all leading up to that final, fatal event on July 11th.
And the way they screened people, I mean, it's just shockingly arbitrary. Soldiers would force men to strip, and they'd look for marks on their bodies. You got marks on your legs from wearing gumboots? Well, every farmer wears gumboots, but to them, you must be a rebel. Marks on your shoulder? Well, that could be from carrying a hoe, but they decided it was from a rifle. Rebel. With methods like this, you can see how countless innocent farmers just got swept up in this whole nightmare.
And the cruelty was systematic. Even before they got to the railway station, the captives were just deliberately humiliated. As this survivor remembers, they weren't treated like suspects. They were treated like objects for the soldiers' entertainment, forced to sing and dance, all while being randomly and brutally beaten. It was an exercise in pure dehumanization.
And this is the goods shed at the Okungulo station. For days, hundreds of men were packed into this structure. They were given no food, no water. They were just subjected to constant beatings and absolute terror. By July 11th, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and completely desperate. And then came the final, cruel deception. On the morning of July 11th, the soldiers asked who wanted water. Of course, they all did. About 120 men who raised their hands were led not to water, but to this train wagon, number C521083. They were forced inside, the doors were bolted shut, and they were just left there in the suffocating heat.
This quote gives you just a small glimpse of the sheer horror inside that wagon. Just try to imagine it, the air getting thick, unbreathable, the heat turning that metal box into an oven. Survivors described just complete chaos and terror as people started to suffocate and panic.
This next part it's just almost impossible to comprehend. People were falling down, being trampled to death. The desperation got so extreme that some, like the man who said this, only survived by drinking urine. After about 4 hours, the soldiers finally opened the doors. Inside, 69 men were dead. 47 had somehow miraculously survived.
You know, the physical ordeal inside that train wagon was over. But for the survivors and for the families of the victims, the aftermath, that brought a whole new, prolonged kind of pain. The government's response over the years became this long story of promises that, according to the community, were made only to be broken.
So a few months after the massacre, President Museveni himself actually visited Mukura. He apologized. He made several big promises: a decent burial for the dead, compensation for the families, accountability for the soldiers who did this, and memorials. But as you can see here, the reality for the victims was something else entirely. They felt like every single one of those promises was either broken or fulfilled in a way that just felt empty and completely disconnected from what they actually needed.
And this is what that looked like on the ground. A promised public library, you can see it on the left, was left as a ruin for over a decade. A memorial school, on the right, was eventually built, but local residents told the researchers they couldn't even afford the fees to send their own kids there. These weren't gestures of healing. To the community, they felt like monuments to neglect. So here's the crucial point. Even when the government did act, it failed. Why? Because it never once consulted the victims. That decent burial was seen as deeply disrespectful. The families, they wanted to take the remains of their loved ones home, to bury them with their own traditions. But instead, the whole thing was handled like a clinical procedure, without their involvement, and that just robbed it of any real healing power.
So why? Why? After all these years and all these official attempts at reconciliation, did healing just fail to happen in Mukura? Well, the JRP report offers some huge lessons here. In fact, the story of Mukura is a powerful case study in how not to do transitional justice.
The report really boils the failure down to 4 critical mistakes. First, and this is the big one, the foundational error. The victims were never meaningfully consulted or involved. Reconciliation was something done to them, not with them. Second, the timing of these initiatives often felt really cynical. For example, a sudden cash payment in 2010, well, it happened right before an election. So many people saw it not as real compensation, but as a political move. Third, there was no real accountability. Yeah, a military inquiry was held, but its findings were never made public. The perpetrators were never seen to face justice, which left this deep feeling that they just got away with it. And finally, even the apologies missed the mark. When the president did apologize, he did it in military fatigues, surrounded by armed guards. For a community traumatized by soldiers, that didn't feel like comfort, it felt like intimidation.
And yet, the community has not forgotten. This image of a survivor pointing to the names of the dead is just such a powerful reminder that memory is kept alive by the people themselves, not by hollow monuments. The story of Mukura teaches us a tragic but vital lesson. True justice and healing can never be forced from the top down. It has to begin, and it has to end with the victims right at the center of the process.
And all of this leaves us with a really profound and difficult question. The events at Mukura happened decades ago, but for the community, those wounds are still wide open. It forces us to ask, what does true reconciliation really require? And what is owed to people who have survived the unimaginable when justice still feels unfinished?